All right, I'm sure many of you have heard the story of the Christmas truce of World War I, but how about a Christmas truce in World War II? So the story goes, in December of 1944, Germany launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, or as it's more commonly known, the Battle of the Bulge. This was Germany's last-ditch effort to try to win the war in the West so they could turn their forces east to face the rapidly advancing Red Army. Germany kicked off their attack on the morning of December 16th in the thick Ardennes forest. The Allies expected the area to be essentially unsuitable for a major offensive. It was already terribly cold out, awful weather, and no significant German preparations had been noticed. In turn, Germany completely surprised the Allied defenders all across the line. The rapid attack broke through the Allied lines in a few places, so much so that entire Allied units quickly found themselves essentially behind enemy lines just as the battle kicked off. The ensuing mix of lines being split and the rapid German advance led to confusion all up and down the Allied ranks. Adding to an already complex battlefield, these weeks during the Battle of the Bulge saw below freezing temperatures, snowstorms, and perpetual fog. This was one of the largest battles ever fought by the U.S. military, and in that scale, it's easy to lose sight of the thousands of individual accounts, some of which are incredibly uplifting, like this one here. As this massive battle began to take form, a German child, Fritz Winken, and his mother Elizabeth were taking shelter in an old cabin deep in the middle of the Ardennes. His father had sent them there for protection because their home of Aachen was getting closer to the front lines and becoming a target for Allied bombers. But because of the heavy snowstorm, he hadn't yet made it out to the cabin himself. Then on Christmas Eve, December 24th, someone knocked at the Winkens' door. Totally unexpected. I mean, they're out in the middle of nowhere. And when Elizabeth opened the door, she saw 3 American soldiers standing there, one of whom was wounded. They asked to come inside. They were lost in the snowstorm, had no idea how to get back to their unit, and were at risk of freezing to death if they remained outside much longer. This was no easy decision for Elizabeth. She was being asked to harbor the enemy. It's hard to say why she did what she would end up doing here. I'd like to think that it was because it was Christmas Eve, but whatever the reason, she allowed the men to come inside and warm themselves while she began to prepare a meal. Not long after, there was another knock at the door. This time, the boy, Fritz, ran to open it and saw 4 German soldiers, also cut off from their unit and worried about freezing to death in the cold. They, too, asked to come in. Elizabeth came forward and told the German soldiers they could come inside, but there were already some visitors they might not like. But it's the Holy Night, and there will be no shooting here, she said. She permitted the German soldiers to come in so long as they left their weapons outside. They agreed, then Elizabeth moved in, collected the Americans' weapons, and moved those outside as well. The 2 groups of soldiers sat on opposite sides in the room in a pretty clearly awkward situation, but eventually, a German soldier broke the silence by singing Silent Night in Latin. Then Americans joined in English. This prompted a German soldier to share the last of his food with the Americans, and one of them, who had prior medical training, came over and provided aid to his wounded enemy. And by the time Elizabeth had a meal prepared for everyone, they were acting like old friends. Warriors wearing 2 different uniforms, but able to come together for one night of peace. The truce lasted through the night, and come morning, the 2 sides prepared to part ways. But before doing so, one of the German soldiers pulled out a map and a compass and gave the Americans directions on how to best get back to their own lines, even advising them to avoid a certain town that had just been captured by the Germans the day prior. The soldiers picked up their weapons, headed off in opposite directions, and disappeared into the snow-covered forest. This whole event was long thought to just be a hopeful tale with no real evidence that it actually happened until 1996. After Unsolved Mysteries told the story on TV, a viewer recognized that same story had been told by a resident of a local nursing home named Ralph Blank. Supposedly one of Ralph's favorite stories from the war was to tell folks when, on Christmas Eve in 1944, he shared a meal with German soldiers in an old cabin during the Battle of the Bulge. Ralph was soon put in touch with the producers of the show, who introduced him to the person who helped them tell that story, a man named Fritz Winken. The boy who, along with his mother Elizabeth, 80 years ago, during one of the deadliest battles of World War II, created a small carve-out in their little cabin for some peace between enemies on Christmas Eve.